The gravity loads were supported by 58 exterior columns and 24 interior columns. That is a plan view of a typical floor of the building, where you see this is the exterior column frames, all of them are moment resisting, and everything inside here is interior columns that were connected to the floor through gravity or shear connections. Pay particular attention to this line of columns, column 79 in particular, followed by column 80 and column 81. You can see that the tributary area assigned to these columns are huge. The span on this side is about 52 feet. That would translate to how many meters? I forgot. Or maybe 17 or 17 meters.
15 to 18.
And I'll show later that kink we showed at the top of the building would correspond to the location of column 79. So a lot of attention would go into that critical column. This again was a composite floor slab, but there were no trusses and no knuckles. The composite action was created by what we call shear studs, where these are elements, steel elements that you put on the top of the top flange of floor girders and beams. Actually, in this case, only floor girders, floor beams. Floor girders didn't have this type of shear connections. But basically, just for the rest of the talk, and when you read our reports, between columns, the elements connected between two columns or resting on two columns, we call these girders. The elements that are resting on the girders, we call them beams. So just always keep in mind the distinction while I'm speaking. This is a girder, this is a girder, but this is a beam. And definitely girders are more important because they can take the load and send it to the car. Some of these columns were huge, and again, if we're focusing on those three columns, you can see there are built-up sections. This is what we call WF wide flange section, and that huge section by itself was not enough, especially in the lower floors, so they added these plates that were welded to the main section in order to carry the load that would be imposed on them. And these plates can have a thickness of up to 6 inches, 15 centimeters. These are some of the structural design features that they have to implement in order to get the load around the Con Ed power station underneath the building. There are lots of transfer girders and lots of trusses that will take, for example, the load of this column and transfer it to this system of columns. And you can see that happening in a lot of locations around the perimeter and around the in the core as well. And the concept of transfer trusses and transfer girders was the subject of intense speculation from the day of this collapse. A lot of people thought that the collapse would definitely have to start somewhere in this mechanism, but that's not what our study is showing. I'm not sure why. Just the roof layout, and you can see this is the east penthouse that we showed early on, that the cake occurred somewhere in the middle, and this is the rest of the structure on top of the roof. Analysis issues. In a way, there were some similarities between the towers investigation and the water cellar investigation, mainly because we are dealing again with fire and how the fire spread. So we had to run analysis of fire growth and spread, and we had to go through the thermal analysis and analysis of structural response to fire. I got a question after the previous session, did we write all these commercial software, or did we write our own software? Basically, FDS, this software is a software that is developed and maintained by NIST. You can actually download it from our website for free, and it's being used to simulate the fire growth. We used ANSYS for this type of modeling, and we used ANSYS for the thermal analysis, and we use ANSYS for this type of analysis to fire. This model, it was a 16-story model of the building that accounted for the thermal loading due to the temperatures that were computed here, and we ran the analysis here all the way up to the initiation of collapse, and then the progression of collapse was conducted using this model in LS Dyna that showed how, after the initial event will occur, as I'll explain later, how would things go all the way to collapse. But between these, we didn't just use some commercially available software, but we wrote our own programs and scripts in order to take the outcome of this analysis and use it as an input for this analysis, for different mesh sizes and for different durations, as I mentioned early on. And same thing here, between the thermal analysis and the structural analysis, we wrote another computer program to take the output of ANSYS in terms of thermal temperature values, in terms of time, and for each of these nodes, and input this into this other ANSYS model, which has different mesh altogether and different time scheme as well. So that's some of the software we use. We also link ANSYS with some user-defined subroutines that were able to capture what we call break elements, that were able to capture the failures, especially at the connections. Because as we'll see here, the connections here will play a tremendous role in the behavior of buildings under fire, which unfortunately we currently do not consider when we design our structures. So the initiating event from this model was fed into this model that simulated the collapse, and this model also included the damage to the exterior of the building due to the collapse of World Trade Center 1, as you can see here in this photograph, and I'll come back to it. Fire was observed, and I'll show some pictures showing that that's the north facade of World Trade Center 7, and this just shows wherever windows were broken or fire was noticed in some of those windows around the perimeter of the building. And we didn't have quite as much photos of the fires as much as we had in the towers, because the towers, we had thousands of photographs. Here, after the collapse of the towers, lots of photographers who were around the building had already left by then. But still, we got enough amount of pictures that would help us characterize the fire growth and the fire movement around the building throughout the rest of the day. Again, for the fire simulations, we had to look at the combustible load inside the building modules, similar to what we have done for the World Trade Center towers, and this shows some of the heat release rates computed for some of the floors. And you can see here a spike around the time of collapse, as have been evidenced by the photographs that I show throughout this presentation. These are some of examples of the fire dynamics modeling, and you see the fire moving from one compartment to another. Fire generally started on this side because this was closest to the collapsing World Trade Center 1. And we concluded that the debris falling from World Trade Center 1 is what started the fires on this side. And the fire started actually on 10 floors, as we saw in lots of pictures. But fires moved in different ways. Some fires moved east and then north. Some fires moved north and then east. But both of them, around the time of collapse, were concentrated in the northeast corner here. And it's not just a simulation that showed that, but as I mentioned early on in the previous presentation, validation was a big issue for us. So we confirmed that behavior with lots of photographs that show for 6 floors, 7 to 9 and 11 to 13, that fires that started here got here somehow, either through this path or through this path. And for these 6 floors around the time of collapse, fire was concentrated here. We noticed that the fire in the core, this is the core area, it's not affected by fire much. The reason is, in the core, we have much combustible load. The core is mainly staircases, elevators, and corridors. There is not much desks and chairs and seats and stuff. So that's why generally the core area would be colder than the rest of the building. So that just summarizes what I was saying. There were fires on 10 floors, but ultimately some of them just burned out throughout the day. But at the time of collapse, the sustained fire, the consistent fires were observed in floors 7 through 9 and 11 through 15. And that was validated by pictures. Similar to what we have done, we took this heat release rates and gas temperatures coming out of FDS, and this is a thermal model of a typical floor. This is floor 13, and you see the evolution of temperature at 3.5 hours from the start. Generally, the start is considered around noon time, but that is subject to some uncertainty. But you can see here the fire is on the southeast corner. It's moving further north, and at about 4:30 or 4.5 hours from the start of the simulation, the fire is concentrated in this northeast corner. And this shows that the temperatures on the steel framing. This shows the temperature on the concrete slab. This shows some of the results of the thermal analysis, how you can capture the temperatures along a beam and along even the connections. While we do not need to model the connection in detail for this type of analysis, we definitely need to do that for the structural analysis. But for the thermal analysis, we didn't need to do that, but it showed that the location of the connection would get a temperature between the temperature of the beam and the temperature, the temperature of the girder and the temperature of the column. Two-phase structural analysis for modeling for this investigation. 16-story model. I said that the fires were mainly from 9 to 11 and 7 to 9 and 11 to 15. So we modeled the structure from floor 0 all the way up to the 16th floor to give us enough boundary conditions above and below the affected floors. And these models accounted for the heating, structural failures, thermal response to collapse initiation, and the time step was seconds to minutes here. This is an LS Dyna model of the whole tower from the ground up, including the damage that was observed due to the collapse of World Trade Center 1, and you can see that some columns are missing at the top and some columns are missing here at the bottom of the building. This took the input from this structural model by inputting here connections to damage to connections and floors, and from there we allow the software or the program to run and give us an indication of whether there is a collapse or no collapse.